How's it going, people? Welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be talking you through how modifications affect your insurance. This is a video a lot of you wanted me to do for quite some time, and what I've basically found out through all of my research is that insurance is indeed a sham. There's almost no logic to it. There's literally almost no logic to insurance. I cannot understand how modifications affect your car. I've made some generalizations from the research that I've done, but the research is almost infinite in terms of how much further it could go. There are some basics that I can share with you, but there are massive differences between cars, between places, between age, between all this kind of stuff. So there are still a lot of unknowns when it comes to modifications. As the video goes on, it's going to get consistently more ridiculous, going from the stuff that does kind of make sense and has some basic use for you to the stuff that is just literally, I have no idea how it even works. Apologies if my voice sounds really weird, I've got a really sore throat, but as always, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So to keep things fair, I basically used quote details from my previous videos where I worked out exactly how to get cheap insurance as a 17-year-old. And just to recap, that means these things on screen right now. I wanted to understand the difference between ages, so I did one quote on a car at 17 years old and then one quote on it at 25 years old. But I also wanted to understand if there was a difference between cars as well, so I looked at the VW Polo, in fact my Polo, I looked at the BMW M2 as a particularly expensive car, I looked at the Ford Focus ST as a car that people would potentially want to tune, and I looked at the Impreza as well as another car that people quite like to tune but costs a little bit less than a 2012 ST. I basically did a quote with no mods on all of these individual cars, as well as with 31 different mods on the cars as well. You can see a list of those 31 mods on screen right now. No details on the quotes changed at all. The quotes were taken from a place that I believe is generally middle of the park when it comes to insurance quotes. In fact, the only thing that changed was that for 25-year-olds I put them as teachers, and as 17-year-olds I put them as students. Now before we look at my findings, let's just discuss the issues with my methodology. So the first issue is that these are quite complex. As you will have seen from previous videos on insurance quotes, the changing of one or two minor factors can completely throw the results of insurance quotes out of the park. So for example, the relative differences between quotes of a teacher might be very different to the relative differences of quotes of a business consultant or something like that. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Another issue is that I only did 4 cars, and I only did that because as I was going through I realised just how different each car was coming up with and the complexities that I was dealing with. As there are thousands of different types of cars on the road, it would be almost impossible to work out an exact science behind this unless you did every single car. And either way, I definitely wouldn't suggest that 4 cars is a representative sample, but it was more than enough for this video, as that came in at 155 individual quotes done by me. So yes, I partially realised that I basically, as a one-man show, would have to go on for a really long time doing these quotes in order to get any kind of representative sample. But anyway, this is the boring stuff. Let's have a look at what I actually found out. So let's start with the differences between age. I did all of my age quotes on the VW Polo 9N. So I did a 17-year-old with no years, no claims as their first car, and a 25-year-old with 7 years, no claims, just to kind of make it realistic. As expected, as a 25-year-old, insurance quotes are less heavily impacted by modifications than for a 17-year-old. The average increase for a 25-year-old was 23%, while the average increase for a 17-year-old was 46%. 27 of the 31 modifications I did had less of an impact on 25-year-olds insurance than they did on 17-year-olds insurance. Strangely, boring out your engine, changing your suspension, or doing a whole bunch of mods in one go worked out to have less of an impact on 17-year-olds insurance than it did on a 25-year-old's insurance. That said, I literally couldn't get an insurance quote for an engine swap, turbocharging, supercharging, or nitrous as a 17-year-old, as is probably quite expected. Interestingly though, there are some modifications for 17-year-olds that really would significantly impact their insurance quotes, such as tinting windows, which brought it up by 70%, strengthening brackets, which brought it up by 107%, and a bonnet bulge, which brought it up by 170% as well. It just really doesn't make any sense. But yes, anyway, to conclude this section, as a 25-year-old, you can expect modifications to impact your insurance less than if you're 17. We can speculate on this and say that maybe as you get older, the relative impact of modifications is cheaper, but that's not necessarily the case. Now let's ignore 17-year-olds for a second and just look at 25-year-olds. As all the quotes of 25-year-olds are made exactly the same, you can understand the difference that each modification has on an insurance quote, and that is across all 4 different cars as well. The graph on screen shows you the difference between no modifications on the far left hand side and all the different modifications that I did. And on screen now you can see the mods that had the smallest impact on insurance quotes. As you can see, locking nuts and seats are 2 things that actually make your insurance quotes decrease. And though this may be anomalous with the seats, it kind of makes sense with locking wheel nuts. Since they make your car more safe by stopping people from stealing your alloys, they would theoretically decrease your insurance quote. That said, it actually only decreased the quote on 1 of the 4 cars, and the other 3 it just had it at 100%, so basically the same as the standard quote. But key ones to note anyway are the brakes being quite cheap, air filters being cheap, stickers and decals as you might expect, a sports wheel, rally lights, and then obviously around those as well there's a few other ones above that, like alloys not being too expensive. But on the other hand, here's a list of those that had the largest impact. As you might expect, basically anything to do with the engine, so swapping it, turbocharging it, supercharging it, or nitrosing it, was a surefire way to increase your insurance quote. I was quite upset to see that upgrading your suspension increased your quotes by around 90% on average, especially considering maybe you've modded your car out madly, you've done some insane performance upgrades on it, but you've decided that you're not going to touch the suspension because you don't want the insurance quotes to increase. That just seems a bit ridiculous, because of course you'd want to do your suspension to keep yourself safe in a car that doesn't squat too much or doesn't go all crazy when you hit bumps. You want to get some nice, tunable, sort-outable suspension. And though I've shown that modifying your engine generally changes your quotes up to around 300 to 500% of what they originally were, it's important to know that you can still chip or map your car for quite a cheap price. Remapping or completely replacing your ECU came out at around about a 36% increase on your standard insurance quote. One thing that I really didn't get is that strengthening your brackets brings up the price by around 42% over the original quote. That just seems ridiculous. You strengthen your brackets to increase the safety of the car and stop things falling off of it, basically. Surely this would be the kind of thing that would decrease your quote, but in fact, no, it's not the case. In fact, in thinking 3 of the 4 cars, it increased the quote by quite a lot. So yes, I would highly recommend not strengthening your brackets just in order to make sure your quotes stay down. One interesting point to note about any engine modifications is that it was generally cheaper to modify the engines on a more expensive car than it was on a much cheaper car. If you compare the M2 to the Polo, for example, it's only a 64% increase to mess around with the turbos in the M2 versus an increase of over 650% for putting a turbo into the VW Polo 9N. And that's not just because the M2 already has turbos. Apply the same logic to the Impreza, the WRX STI, which of course already has a turbo. Modifying that turbo brings up the price by over 250%, still way more than the M2. What I also thought was ridiculous, that it's actually cheaper to supercharge your Impreza WRX STI than it is to mess around with the turbos, and it's exactly the same price to mess around with the turbos on the M2 as it is to supercharge it. I feel like the insurers have just not looked at this at all. Also, while editing the video, I've just realised that the ECU prices for the Impreza and the M2 are way more expensive than for the ST and the Polo. Chipping the Polo increased the price by only 3%, similarly with the ST it's only 6%, but with the M2 and the Impreza it's 48% each. I would speculate that has something to do with the turbos or the type of cars that you're chipping, but even then I honestly think that insurance companies just pluck these numbers out of the air. Now in the description you'll find a link to all of my raw data for this video, and that will basically show you the point that I mentioned at the start, that the average being based on only 4 cars makes this video not a truly representative sample of all of the cars out there on the road. Some key highlights of that though are the real differences between some of the cars. So on the M2 for example, 15 of the 31 mods made absolutely no difference to the quote without mods. An aftermarket exhaust doesn't change your quote, Rocket Bunny wide arch flares don't affect your quote, fitting racing seats in the car doesn't affect your quote. It's basically the ultimate car for modding. This was similar to the Polo. The vast majority of modifications only increased your quote by 1%. But the real MVP when it comes to this is the Impreza, which is actually cheaper to insure with alloys on it or cheaper to insure with seats on it than it is to insure the car with no mods at all. It's a 23% drop in your annual quote just for having some bucket seats in the car. It was a drop of around about £300 for me, so that means that's basically part of the way to a set of seats. I really don't understand how some of the mods can actually decrease the value of your quote in this sense, but that does bring me on to the final section of this video. This may sound a little bit like ranting, and I apologize if that's the case, but ultimately, some of the stuff I found while researching for this video has just been ridiculous and I need to share it with you. Let's kick it off with a basic one. In general, black box insurance is more expensive than no black box insurance. All of the quotes I've been basing this video on have been no black box insurance, and black boxes have been generally just way higher in terms of their quotes. For the vast majority of the quotes that I did for this video, you can't get a quote for black box insurance at all. And though obviously I see this as a positive thing, I'm also a bit like, hang on, you'll allow people to drive their cars however they want to, having done some insane modifications to them, but you won't let them drive exactly how they want to without them. That just really doesn't make any sense in my head. Another weird one for me is why fiddling with the turbo on already turbocharged cars costs so much, especially when compared with some of the other engine mods. On 3 of the 4 cars, in fact, it's actually cheaper to fully engine swap your car than turbocharge or supercharge it. How does that make any sense? Let's say you LS swapped my Polo, that would be cheaper to insure than if you just took the turbo out of the 180 and shoved it on my 1.2. I mentioned it already as well, but tinting windows, I don't understand why that's a 70% increase for 17-year-olds, but then like a 1% or 0% increase for 25-year-olds. Does your eyesight get better between 17 and 25? What is it that causes this to be particularly high? I mean, you can assume that the reason will be because 17-year-olds with tinted windows are crashing more than 25-year-olds with tinted windows, but irrespective, I just think that's an absolutely ridiculous difference. And just to really drive that point home, let's say you're 17 years old and you uprate your brakes. That'll cost you an extra 5% per year. Let's say you get braided hoses, that will also increase your quote by 5% per year. But let's say you decide to get both uprated brakes and braided hoses. Suddenly it becomes a 70% increase per year. So is it the case that 17-year-olds with uprated brakes or braided hoses are crashing less than those with both? Or is it the case that having more than one modification is generally worse for your insurance as a 17-year-old? Or is this just insurance being stupid? And the final point I wanted to talk about when it comes to insurance and how ridiculous it is the body kit. Not including 17-year-olds, the body kit generally costs as much as any individual piece for the car as well. Which is fair enough. If you're planning on insuring your car with a body kit, do the whole body kit rather than each piece individually. But then there are some individual parts of a body kit that are more expensive to insure than the entire body kit put together. For example, on 2 of the 4 cars, it was more expensive to get flared wheel arches than a full body kit. I'm going to basically end the meat of this video here by simply saying I really don't understand insurance. However hard I try and however hard I research, it still brings out these ridiculous anomalies that I just simply cannot understand. I will of course continue to research insurance and hopefully build on this video in the near future. So hopefully this video has helped some of you in terms of finding out what modifications you can do to your car without expecting to spend loads on insurance. I know that there is so much more research that can be done on this, and I probably will do some more over the longer period of time, but honestly, you could carry on researching this topic for ages. I wanted to say a massive thank you to my patrons who should all be on screen right now. Really appreciate their support. Remember to follow me on Instagram where I'm posting every single day. Like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. But as always, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.